3:15 a.m. I was exiting the post through the north gate at Fort Liberty when my cell buzzed against my hip. 22 years of service. A Bronze Star nobody outside a locked filing cabinet has ever seen. And I still flinched at a phone ringing that early. It was my mother. She was weeping. The kind of weeping that doesn't come from a 71-year-old woman, unless something has been broken in her, physically, right then. "Your spouse called me a senile old hag," she said. Then he hit me with a solid wooden club. 19 minutes after that call, I shoved open the double doors of the 5th precinct so hard the glass cracked against the frame. The whole place fell quiet. Officers mid-sentence just stopped. The duty officer glanced up from his monitor, and then he turned dead pale. "Ma'am," he said, "listen, let me clarify. If you're watching this at 3 a.m., the way I was that night, running on nothing but adrenaline, and 22 years of training your face not to show what you're feeling, comment where you're watching from. Like this video, subscribe, and stay with me. Because what happened in that precinct, and later in that courtroom, is the reason I stopped letting anyone call me just paperwork. I need to take you back 3 years before that call, because you won't understand why the desk sergeant went pale, unless you understand what my family had spent a decade convincing themselves I was. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Rachel Voss, 34 years old, and for 11 of my 14 years in uniform, my official personnel file said, Logistics and Administrative Coordinator, Fort Liberty Medical Support Command. That was true, technically, the way a locked box is technically empty until you know the combination. What that file didn't say was that I ran classified medical logistics for a Joint Special Operations Task Force under the designation Nightshade, coordinating casualty evacuation routes for units that didn't officially exist in 3 countries I'm still not permitted to name in full. I signed forms that made grown generals nervous. I briefed men with more stars on their collar than I have fingers, and at home, at every dinner table, every holiday, every argument, I was the one who does the paperwork. That was the first open loop, the one that would take a sealed envelope and a general's sworn word to finally crack open. The second loop started the day I married Bradley Voss, and it had been quietly rotting for 9 years by the time my mother called me bleeding. The third loop, the one that terrified me most, was simpler than either. Who was going to find out the truth about me, and when, and what it would cost the people who'd spent a decade underestimating me on purpose. Bradley and I met at a fundraising gala in Fayetteville in the autumn I made captain. He was 31 then, a real estate developer with a business card that said Managing Partner, Voss Meridian Properties, and a smile that made 3 separate senior officers' wives lean over and tell me I'd landed well. What none of them saw, and what I didn't fully understand until year 4, was that Voss Meridian Properties was mostly Bradley's father's money, mostly his father's name on the loans, and mostly Bradley's talent for spending both. By the time we married, his father was 2 years dead, and the company was already sliding, quietly, the way a ship takes on water below the waterline where the passengers can't see it. I didn't marry him for his balance sheet. I married him because in the beginning, he asked me questions about my work, and actually waited for the answers, even the redacted ones. I married him because he sat with me in a hospital waiting room, in Landstuhl, Germany, for 6 hours, after I flew home, wounded from an extraction that went sideways, in a country I'm still not cleared to name. 3 pieces of shrapnel in my hip, and he held my hand and didn't ask me to explain what happened. That man existed. I want you to know that before I tell you what he became, because it matters. It matters that I wasn't a fool from the start. I was a fool slowly, over 9 years, the way you're a fool about a leaking roof, until the ceiling finally comes down on your bed. The label started small. At a dinner with his mother, Diane Voss, in year 2 of our marriage, someone asked what I did in the army. Before I could answer, Bradley said, "Oh, Rachel handles paperwork. Very organized. Keeps the medical supply chain running, that kind of thing." It wasn't a lie, exactly. It was a shrinking. He took 11 years of classified work, 2 deployments, a citation I'm still not allowed to describe in detail, and folded it down into something that fit comfortably next to his own failing company, at a dinner table, something that wouldn't outshine him. Diane, 71 that year, had a single fixed expression she wore every time my career came up. A thin, patient smile that said, "Without a word, I've decided what you are, and nothing you say will move me." How nice. She told me that first dinner, that you found something steady while Bradley builds the real future for this family. I let it go. I let it go the next 40 or 50 times too, because I was gone 8-10 months a year, on rotations I couldn't discuss. And a woman who's rarely home doesn't get to spend her leave time fighting for the last word at her mother-in-law's table. That was the mistake. Silence, in that family, was read as confirmation. By year 5, Voss Meridian Properties was 2 balloon payments from collapse, and Bradley had started disappearing on what he called site visits that ran until 1 or 2 a.m. I found the first hotel charge on a shared card in March of that year, a Marriott 40 minutes from a property he claimed to be inspecting, $310 for a single night, and when I asked, he told me contractors run late, ma'am, don't they? In your world too. I let that go as well. I had a task force to run, and a marriage I still believed could be repaired, with enough patience, and I told myself the sourness in my stomach was suspicion, not evidence. It was evidence. Her name was Vanessa Cole, 36, a leasing agent Bradley had hired at Voss Meridian 18 months earlier, and by the time I finally saw her name on a hotel confirmation email he forgot to delete. She and Bradley had been involved for over 2 years. Vanessa had exactly one calculated trait. She never dropped in any of our 3 direct confrontations over the following years. She spoke about my marriage, the way a contractor talks about a demolition already scheduled, patient, unbothered, certain of the outcome. "Rachel, I think you and I both know where this is headed," she told me once, in a parking garage, adjusting a sunglasses case in her purse like she was checking her watch. "I'm not in a hurry. Bradley isn't either." That composure, that total absence of guilt, was the trait, and it never once cracked. Not until a courtroom in April 3 years later, but I'm getting ahead of the story. The envelope, the pebble, the whole avalanche would eventually roll from, arrived in the mail on a Tuesday in October of what turned out to be the final year of my marriage. It came from the Department of the Army Board for Correction of Military Records, addressed to me, unopened by anyone but me, a single sealed manila folder, marked with a classification cover sheet. I recognized instantly, because I'd stamped 100 like it myself. Inside was a formal notice that my personnel file was being fully updated, unsealing certain records tied to Operation Nightshade for the purposes of a pending Silver Star recommendation from my former task force commander, then Colonel, now Major General Harold Ferris. I read it twice at my kitchen table at 6 a.m., before anyone else was awake, and I put it in the bottom drawer of my study desk, under a stack of old training manuals, because I wasn't ready yet for it to be true, and because some old habit of secrecy in me said hold this close until you need it. I didn't know yet how soon I'd need it. That folder sat in that drawer for 5 months, the single concrete thread that would eventually unravel everything Bradley, Diane, Vanessa, and their attorney believed about who I was. The gatekeeper on Bradley's side, once the filing came, was Gordon Pierce, senior partner at Pierce Halloway Family Law, a man who wore his confidence like cologne, too much of it, applied before he walked into any room. Gordon's fixed trait across every deposition, every hearing, every clipped phone call between counsel, was performative professional arrogance, the habit of narrating his own brilliance out loud, whether anyone asked him to or not. "I've handled 40 divorces involving military pensions," he told my attorney in our first joint call, loud enough that I could hear it through the speaker from across the room. "This one's not complicated. She's an administrative officer. Her retainer on the pension side is going to be modest, and frankly, once the court sees the full custody picture, I doubt we're even discussing her service record in detail." He said administrative officer, the way you'd describe wallpaper. I said nothing. I let him build his case on that assumption for 5 months, the way you let a man keep digging a hole he thinks is a foundation. The filing itself came on a Thursday in December, delivered to me by a process server at the gate of Fort Liberty while I was in my dress uniform for a change of command ceremony. 22 years of service standing in formation not 40 feet away, while a stranger in a windbreaker handed me papers stating that Bradley Franklin Voss was petitioning for divorce, primary physical custody of our 2 children, Owen, age 8, and Grace, age 5, and, buried on page 11, a claim disputing my entitlement to the full survivor benefit plan and pension division we'd agreed to in our original marriage, on the grounds that my actual military role and earning capacity had been materially misrepresented throughout the marriage. I read that line 3 times standing at the gate in my dress blues. Misrepresented. He had spent 9 years telling his own mother I did paperwork, and now he intended to use my silence about my classified service as a weapon to strip me of both my children and my pension, arguing in essence that I'd hidden something from him, when the truth was the precise opposite. I had hidden nothing that wasn't legally required to stay hidden, and he had spent 9 years choosing not to ask, because not asking let him feel like the more accomplished one at every table we sat at. The pension figure Gordon's filing cited was wrong on purpose, calculated low. He claimed my retired pay at 20 years would land near $41,000 annually, treating my rank as though I'd separate as a major, rather than retire, as I intended, at lieutenant colonel with over 22 years, closer to $68,000 plus disability compensation, tied to the Landstuhl injury. Diane's fingerprints were all over the framing too. In a text message my own attorney later entered into evidence, Diane had written to Bradley in January, "Tell Gordon to push the earning capacity angle hard. She's never been anything but a glorified clerk. No judge is going to believe a paperwork officer deserves half of anything real." I didn't see that message until March. When I did, sitting in my attorney's office with my hands flat on the conference table to keep them from shaking, I thought about the sealed envelope in my desk drawer, and for the first time, I let myself feel something close to anticipation instead of grief. My allies didn't arrive by accident. The first was my attorney, Colonel Frank Delgado, U.S. Army, retired, a former Judge Advocate General officer, with 26 years in uniform, before he opened his own family law practice, specializing in military pension and custody disputes. Frank had a habit of reading case files twice before he said a single word about strategy, and the first time I handed him the sealed envelope from the Board for Correction of Military Records, he read it 3 times, set it down, and said, "Rachel, do you understand what you're holding? This isn't just a pension argument anymore. This is a fraud problem for them." The second ally was my mother, Eleanor Voss, no relation by blood to Bradley's family, despite the coincidence of surname from her own long marriage decades earlier, 71 years old, sharp as a bayonet, who drove 4 hours every other weekend from her home in Asheville to watch Owen and Grace while I worked, and who never once, in 9 years, pretended to like Bradley. "That man has never done an honest day's labor in his life," she told me at Thanksgiving the year before the filing, loud enough for Diane to hear from the next room. I raised a lieutenant colonel. He raised a boy who plays developer with his dead father's money. My third ally, informal but load-bearing, was my son Owen, 8 years old, who one evening in February, unprompted, asked me at the dinner table, "Mum, is it true you were a secretary in the army? Dad says that's why you were gone so much. Just filing stuff." I looked at my son's face, waiting for an answer, and I told him the only true thing I could tell an 8-year-old about classified work. "I did important work, Owen, work that helped keep soldiers alive. Someday you'll understand more of it. For now, trust that your mother has never lied to you about what matters." He nodded, satisfied, the way children are when an adult's tone carries more conviction than the words themselves. The custody evaluation, ordered by the court in February, was where Loop B began closing its first layer, roughly 40% into this story. The court-appointed evaluator, a licensed psychologist named Dr. Patricia Kwan, interviewed both Bradley and me separately over 3 sessions each. In his second session, according to Dr. Kwan's written report, later entered as an exhibit, Bradley stated, "Rachel's job kept her away from the kids for most of their early years. I was the one doing bath time, bedtime, everything. She's basically been a part-time parent with a full-time excuse." Reading that line for the first time, sitting across from Frank Delgado in his office, with the manila folder still resting, unopened by the court, In my desk drawer at home, I felt something in my chest go very cold and very still. The same stillness I remembered from the moment shrapnel entered my hip in Landstuhl, and my body simply decided, calmly, we will deal with the pain later, right now we survive. I did not cry. I have not cried once through any part of this. Not the filing, not the deposition, not the hearing itself. And I won't apologize for that, because the men and women I served beside taught me that grief handled loudly rarely gets you anything but an audience, while grief handled with discipline sometimes gets you justice. If this story has you thinking about the sacrifices in your own family that nobody ever properly named out loud, hit like on this video right now and subscribe, because the next part is where the mask came off Bradley Voss for good, and you don't want to miss how it happened. Loop B closed fully on a Tuesday evening in early March, 2 months before the hearing, in the parking lot of Owens Elementary School, during a scheduled custody exchange. I arrived to pick up the children and found Vanessa Cole standing beside Bradley's car, her hand resting on his forearm in the casual, proprietary way of someone who no longer bothers hiding, while Grace, 5 years old, sat buckled in the back seat holding a stuffed rabbit and watching the two adults with the particular blankness children develop when they've learned not to react to things they don't understand. We weren't trying to hide this from you forever, Rachel, Bradley said, not quite meeting my eyes. Vanessa's been a stabilizing presence for the kids. Honestly, given how much time you've been away over the years, I think they've needed that. Vanessa said nothing, only watched me with that same parking garage patience, the demolition contractor calm, as if my reaction to seeing her hand on my husband's arm in front of my children was simply one more variable she'd already priced into her plan. I signed the exchange paperwork. I buckled Grace's rabbit more securely into her lap. I said, I'll see you Sunday at 6, exactly as the order states, and I drove away with my hands steady on the wheel and my pulse, if I'm honest, somewhere near 140 beats a minute, a number I know precisely because I still wear a fitness tracker from my last deployment, out of habit, more than necessity. That was Loop B's first full closing, but not its cruelest layer. That came 9 days later, when my mother called me weeping at 3:15 a.m. Eleanor had driven up unannounced that Monday evening to drop off a birthday gift for Grace early, since she'd be traveling the actual week of the party, and found Bradley at the house during what should have been my custodial evening, packing a box of Grace's clothing into his car without notice to me, in direct violation of the temporary custody order Frank had secured in February. When Eleanor asked him, calmly by her own later account, what he thought he was doing, Bradley told her this wasn't her business, that she was, in his words, a senile old hag who spent 9 years poisoning Rachel against people who actually love this family. When Eleanor stepped between him and the car door, refusing to let him leave, with Grace's belongings outside the custody schedule, Bradley picked up a length of solid oak, a decorative fence post from the side yard he'd been meaning to install for 18 months, and struck her once across the left forearm as she raised it to protect her face, hard enough to fracture the radius in 2 places, hard enough that Eleanor, 71 years old, went down onto the driveway gravel and had to call me from where she lay, because she couldn't stand. I was on post, finishing an after-hours briefing on a logistics contingency plan, when my phone buzzed at 3:15 a.m. I want you to understand exactly what 19 minutes means to someone with my training. It means I heard my mother's voice break on the word, club, and something in me that had been trained for 14 years to compartmentalize, to move, to execute, simply took over. I don't fully remember the drive. I remember arriving at the emergency room first, seeing my mother's arm already splintered, her face grey with shock and pain, a Fort Liberty City police officer taking her statement with visible discomfort, because Bradley, it turned out, had called the same precinct first, 22 minutes before I did, and reported that an elderly woman had trespassed on his property and become combative. A version of events the desk sergeant, a young man named Officer Daniel Reyes, had apparently begun typing into a preliminary incident report before I walked through those precinct doors at 3:34 a.m., and the entire building fell silent. Officer Reyes went pale, not because of my rank, which he didn't yet know, but because my mother, from her gurney, had just finished giving a second, contradicting statement, and now the wife of the man he'd been quietly sympathizing with over the phone had arrived in person, and something in his gut told him the story he'd been handed didn't match the woman standing in front of him. "Ma'am," he said, "listen, let me clarify. Your husband called this in as a trespassing and assault complaint against your mother. We were treating this as a self-defense matter on his end." I looked at him, at the fluorescent lights, at my mother's splintered arm visible through the open door of the exam room behind him, and I said, in the same flat, controlled voice I used to brief a room of colonels, "My mother is 71 years old and weighs 118 pounds. The man who called you weighs 210. I want the fence post logged as evidence tonight. I want photographs of my mother's injury before that swelling changes shape. And I want your incident report to reflect that a battery occurred. Because if it doesn't, I promise you, officer, this department and I will have a much longer conversation than either of us wants." The fracture was documented. The fence post was logged. Bradley was arrested 4 days later on a second-degree battery charge, released on bond within hours, but arrested nonetheless, and that arrest, more than anything Gordon Pierce could spin in a courtroom, told our children's teachers, our neighbors, and eventually the family court judge, exactly what kind of man had been telling everyone, for 9 years, that I was the unstable one, gone too often, unreliable, just paperwork. The final weeks before the hearing were the hardest, not because the facts had turned against me, but because Diane and Gordon, cornered by the arrest and mounting evidence, escalated rather than retreated. Gordon filed an emergency motion alleging I had coached my mother's testimony and requesting a forensic accountant review my military pay records for what he called undisclosed compensation, inconsistent with a standard administrative role, a phrase that, unknown to him, was about to become the single most embarrassing sentence of his professional career. Diane, in a final act of the same fixed contempt she'd worn at every dinner table for 9 years, sent me a text message the week before the hearing that read, "You will never convince a judge you were anything more than a secretary who got lucky marrying up. Bradley built something real. You typed reports." I read that message standing in my kitchen at 6 a.m., the same hour I'd first read the board for correction letter 5 months earlier, and I finally opened the bottom drawer of my study desk, lifted out the stack of training manuals, and unsealed the envelope fully in front of Frank Delgado that afternoon. Inside, alongside the Silver Star recommendation paperwork, was a formal, declassified summary of my service record under Operation Nightshade, 14 years of active duty, 2 deployments to classified theaters, Commandovania of Medical Evacuation Logistics, credited with preserving 41 lives across 19 documented extraction operations, a Bronze Star with Valor device, awarded in my 6th year of service, and a forensic financial detail that would matter far more in court than any medal. My full retired pay entitlement at 22 years of service, verified by the Defense Finance and Accounting Service, was $68,400 annually, plus a disability rating of 40%, tied directly to the Landstuhl injury, a rating Bradley had known about for 9 years and had never once disclosed to Gordon Pierce, because disclosing it would have undercut his own earning capacity argument. Frank read the full packet twice, set it down, and said only, "Rachel, we're not walking into that courtroom next week. We're walking into it with an anvil." Preparing for the hearing meant one final confrontation, this one with General Harold Ferris himself, who agreed, on 11 days' notice, to fly in and give a sworn statement in person rather than by affidavit, a gesture Frank called almost unheard of for a 2-star general in a civil family matter. "I don't do this for pension disputes," Ferris told me the night before, standing in his service uniform, 3 rows of ribbons I still recognize instinctively. "I do it because for 11 years, Lieutenant Colonel Voss was told at her own dinner table she filed paperwork, while she's the reason 41 of my soldiers came home. That ends tomorrow. I did not sleep. I lay in my mother's guest room, her cast on the pillow beside her, listening to Owen and Grace breathing next door, running the next day's testimony, the way I once ran extraction routes, until every variable had a contingency. The courtroom on the morning of the hearing was fuller than any custody proceeding I'd witnessed in years, because word travels fast in a military town, and by 9 a.m., 3 rows on my side of the gallery held retired officers in civilian clothes. 2 of Eleanor's neighbors, Owen and Grace's second grade and kindergarten teachers who'd come on their own time, and, silently, near the back, Officer Daniel Reyes, off duty, still uneasy about the report he'd almost let stand. Judge Miriam Calloway, a 20-year veteran of family court, known for running a tight courtroom, opened the session by addressing the forensic accountant's motion first, and it was there that Gordon Pierce, still performing confidence for an audience that had already begun to see through it, made his fatal declaration. "Your Honor," he said, adjusting his tie, "the petitioner's position remains that the respondent's actual military role has been consistently overstated by her counsel for strategic advantage in these proceedings. She was, functionally, an administrative officer. She was never a soldier in any meaningful operational sense, and the pension figures her attorney has submitted are, frankly, fabricated." He said it loudly. He said it the way a man says something he's said 40 times before and expects no one in the room to challenge. General Ferris was sworn in immediately after. Judge Calloway, reviewing the declassification cover sheet Frank had submitted, read a portion of the unsealed service summary into the record herself, her voice cutting through the room, the way my mother's fence post had cut through Bradley's illusion of impunity 9 days earlier. Lieutenant Colonel Rachel Voss, the judge read, commanded classified medical evacuation logistics under Operation Nightshade across 2 deployment theaters, is credited with the preservation of 41 lives across 19 extraction operations, and holds a Bronze Star with Valor device. General Ferris, from the witness stand, added under oath, "She was never a soldier in any meaningful operational sense," is respectfully one of the most inaccurate statements I have heard in 31 years of service. Lieutenant Colonel Voss ran logistics that special operations units in 3 theaters depended on for their survival. I would not be alive today, and neither would 40 other men, without decisions she made under fire. The gallery went silent the exact way that Precinct had gone silent 19 minutes after my mother's phone call, and I watched Gordon Pierce's face lose its color, the same way Officer Reyes's had, watched Diane Voss, seated rigid in the second row, press her lips into a thin line that was no longer a smile of anything, watched Bradley, at the petitioner's table, stare down at his own hands. The financial forensics closed Lupe completely. Frank's forensic accountant, Marcus Whitfield, testified that Bradley had, 11 months before filing, forged my digital signature on a survivor benefit plan modification form, attempting to redirect 22% of my future survivor benefit to a joint checking account he shared, unknown to me, with Vanessa Cole, opened 4 months earlier. The signature forensics were unambiguous, cross-matched against 19 verified samples from my personnel file. "This isn't a pension dispute anymore, Your Honor," Frank said, standing, his voice level in the particular way I'd come to trust over 5 months of preparation. "This is attempted financial fraud against a federal benefit, committed against a service member who was, at the time, deployed in a classified operational status her own husband knew about and chose to exploit." Judge Calloway did not raise her voice. She simply set down her pen, looked first at Bradley, then at Gordon Pierce, and said, "Counselor, I'd strongly advise revisiting your client's position before we proceed further, because what I'm hearing described is no longer a family law matter alone." Then came the moment the whole courtroom, whether they knew it or not, had been waiting 9 days for, since that fence post came down across my mother's arm in a driveway 40 minutes from where we now sat. Judge Calloway turned to Diane Voss's earlier deposition, entered as an exhibit, in which Diane had stated under oath, echoing the same phrase Bradley used to Eleanor in the driveway, and the same phrase Gordon had just repeated in open court, that the respondent was never truly a soldier, only ever really a secretary who happened to wear a uniform. The judge read the line back into the record, let it sit in the silence for a long 3 seconds, and then said, evenly, "The record before this court establishes, beyond any credible dispute, that Lieutenant Colonel Voss's classified service is directly responsible for the preservation of 41 lives, that she sustained combat-adjacent injury in the line of that service, and that her husband, knowing the full extent of her record, chose repeatedly, in this family and apparently in this courtroom, to diminish it for personal and financial advantage. The line that had followed me through 9 years of Thanksgiving dinners, through a parking lot, through a driveway assault, came back inverted, in the mouth of the one authority in that room, whose word could not be dismissed as bias or loyalty, and something in my chest finally, quietly, exhaled. The ruling, 2 hours later after a brief recess, was not close. Judge Calloway granted me primary physical custody of Owen and Grace, citing the documented battery against their maternal grandmother and Bradley's demonstrated pattern of deception before the court. She ordered the full, undiminished division of my pension, as originally calculated by the Defense Finance and Accounting Service, $68,400 annually at the 22-year mark, with the attempted survivor benefit plan forgery, referred separately to federal prosecutors, given the interstate nature of military pension fraud. Bradley's battery charge against Eleanor proceeded separately in criminal court, where he pled guilty to a reduced charge and received 18 months of probation, a fine, and a permanent no-contact order regarding my mother. Gordon Pierce, in the weeks that followed, quietly withdrew from 3 other pending military pension cases after a state bar complaint, filed independently by 2 other military spouses who'd read about the hearing in a local paper, alleged he'd systematically undervalued service member pensions across multiple cases, using the same administrative role framing. The epilogue unfolded over the following 7 months, unevenly, because consequences rarely land the same way twice. Diane Voss, whose social identity in Fayetteville had rested on her son's image and her own standing, was quietly dropped from 2 charitable boards once the story circulated, and by autumn had stopped attending the country club functions she'd once organized. She moved near her sister in Charlotte, and I haven't spoken to her since, though she sent Grace an unsigned birthday card in June, that Grace taped to her wall anyway. Vanessa Cole left Voss Meridian within 6 weeks, the joint account frozen pending the fraud referral, and relocated to Charleston. She never reached out, and I never expected her to, because her calm was never guilt waiting to surface, only patience for an outcome that was never hers to control. Gordon Pierce's firm dissolved its family law division 18 months later. Bradley's reckoning was slower and more complicated, because he is still my children's father, and I never wanted Owen and Grace to see him as a cartoon villain, rather than a flawed man who made specific, documented choices. 4 months after the hearing, at a supervised exchange, Bradley asked to speak with me alone, and Frank allowed it within sight. "I've been in counseling," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Court mandated at first, then I kept going on my own. I don't expect that to change the pension, or the charges, or what I did to your mother. I just wanted to say it once, out loud. I spent 9 years needing you to be smaller than me, and I turned that into a story I told everyone, including myself, until I believed it. I did not forgive him fully that day, because some debts a ruling settles, and some you simply live alongside for years. But I told him our children would need him to keep telling the truth from now on, and that this, imperfect as it was the only reconciliation I had use for. Not romance, but 2 parents capable of being honest with their kids." Eleanor's arm healed in 11 weeks, though she says on cold mornings she still feels where the bone knit back together. A small, permanent reminder written into her body, the way my own service was once written into a file that used to be sealed. General Ferris's Silver Star recommendation was formally approved 5 months later, and I wore it for the first time at a ceremony Owen and Grace attended in the front row. Owen in a small suit he insisted on picking himself, watching with an expression I recognized, the look of a child recalibrating everything he thought he understood about a parent. Afterward, in the parking lot, he asked me quietly, "Mum, were you scared, on those missions?" And I told him the truest thing I know, the thing I want to leave you with tonight if you've sat through 9 years of someone in your own life shrinking you down to something smaller and safer for their own comfort. I was scared plenty of times in 14 years of service, but I was never once as afraid on any extraction under fire as I was, for almost a decade, sitting quietly at my own dinner table, letting people I loved decide who I was, instead of telling them myself. Don't let anyone hand you a smaller story about your own life, just because the truth is inconvenient for their version of themselves. What sacrifices in your own family have gone unnamed for years, the way mine did, waiting for someone finally willing to open a sealed envelope and say it out loud? None of that, though, is the part of this story I still think about most on nights I can't sleep. It's the 90 seconds between hanging up with my mother and pulling into that precinct parking lot. 19 minutes of driving I genuinely don't remember, because somewhere in that stretch of dark highway, before any judge, before any general, before Gordon Pierce ever opened his mouth in that courtroom, I had already decided something Bradley, Diane, and Gordon never once accounted for in 5 months of building their case against a woman they'd agreed among themselves was harmless. They built an entire legal strategy on the assumption that the quiet one at the dinner table, the one who never raised her voice, who let Diane's comments slide for 9 years, who signed exchange paperwork without argument in a school parking lot, while her husband's mistress stood there with her hand on his arm, was quiet because she was small. They mistook 14 years of operational discipline for passivity, and if there's one thing I need you to sit with tonight, one thing I never got to say out loud in that courtroom, because Judge Calloway's ruling did the talking for me, it's this. The next video in your feed right now is about a master sergeant who sat through 4 years of her own husband, telling their children she didn't really deploy, she just did training exercises. Right up until the day his affair partner made one phone call to the wrong number and reached her instead. You've already sat through this whole story with me, which means some part of you already wants to know how it ends for her too. So go ahead and press subscribe now, because you and I both know you're not walking away from this channel tonight without watching that one next.